My guest today is Lynne Balzer.
I'm a graduate of Temple University, and I taught chemistry, physics, and biology on the high school and college level for about 20 years. And I also ran an electronics business for many years with my son. And I have a lifetime FCC radio telephony license with a radar endorsement. And I wrote 2 books about climate change, the most recent of which is Exposing the Great Climate Change Lie. And I'm a member of Clintel also and a signer of their statement that there's no climate emergency. And having been a teacher, what concerns me the most is the devastating effect that this constant fear-mongering by the media and our elected officials is having on our young people, which is really sad. Climate change is a huge topic. We can't cover it all here, but I'd like to focus on a few main points that we should all know how to handle the blowback that we get when we expressed out that Earth is going to burn up in 6 years. Apparently, the Earth did warm up a bit in 2023 and 2024. Some scientists believe that the small temperature increase was caused by the eruption of the Tonga volcano in January of 2022. This underwater volcano shot about 150 million tons of water 53 kilometers into the stratosphere. Water vapor is the strongest greenhouse gas, so that could have influenced the temperature. That was the largest underwater explosion ever recorded by modern scientific instruments. Anyway, when you Google climate change, this is what comes up. 2024 is the hottest year in the last 125,000 years. The global average temperature for January through September of 2024 was 1.54 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So therefore, we need to stop burning fossil fuels as soon as possible. We may already have reached a tipping point beyond which we won't be able to stop the process. So how did the experts come to this conclusion? And why is it absolutely critical to check these statements to see if they're correct? Because if there's any chance that they're wrong about this, then we would have wasted trillions and trillions of dollars breaking our economies. Trillions of dollars have already been spent on climate change mitigation efforts, and without proper fertilizer made from natural gas, billions of people could starve. We'll lose our modes of transportation, and unreliable wind and solar have already proven to be totally inadequate for our energy needs. So did they follow the scientific method? Well, first of all, it would be our initial observation, which is that the Earth is warmer than it was 200 years ago. We're talking about the temperature of the entire planet, not just one area. So how would we figure out what the average would be for the whole planet? And then the question is, what caused that to happen? And then the hypothesis, of course, would be that we caused it by burning fossil fuels, causing more carbon dioxide to accumulate in the atmosphere. If this is correct, we should be able to make predictions then that would hold up. This map shows where the temperatures were being recorded daily about 100 plus years ago. And you'll see that it was mainly in the United States and Australia and then some over in Europe. But as you can see, most of the globe wasn't really being represented at all. There's no weather stations in South America, Africa, and most of Asia, and in the Arctic and Antarctic. And plus that, the ocean covers 70% of the Earth's surface. So in most of the world, temperatures were not being recorded daily back in 1850. Temperature readings in other parts of the world were sparse and non-existent. Okay, but things are a little bit different today. Satellites record temperatures by remote sensing, and we can get a more uniform average for the whole Earth because of that. But the question is, what happened before 1979, right? Okay, the global average temperature for January through September 2024 was 1.54 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But how are they getting this to the Earth to the hundreds of a degree? That's the question, when they couldn't even average the temperatures back in 1850. So that's a problem. Okay, Thermometers weren't used to record temperatures until about the year 1700. For the years before that, we have to rely on substitutes called proxy data. Now, these could be from tree rings or ice cores or sediment cores. And of course, proxy data are not as accurate as thermometer data. So one kind of proxy data would be tree rings. And those are bigger in warmer years, but they're also bigger in earlier stages of growth of the tree and years with more rain. Another kind of proxy data is ice cores. And that ice core is a long cylinder drilled into a glacier or frozen lake. This one's from Lake Vostok in Antarctica. Well, they're one of the best kinds of proxy measurement that we have because oxygen isotopes can provide clues for how hot or cold it was at a certain type of time in history, in geologic history. Well, this graph of ice core data shows no correlation at all between the temperature. There's the temperature, and as you can see, it's getting lower as time goes on. This goes back 450 million years, and you can see that the carbon dioxide was not correlating at all with the temperature. And we're at one of the lowest levels right now for carbon dioxide. Here's where we are right now. And this graph over on the right is showing how carbon dioxide the percentage has gone up. Now here's a photo taken by satellite over the North Pole. And you can see how some of the ice has melted. This shows where it's melted. This shows where we're getting more ice. So actually, it looks like the gains are a little bit better than the losses on that. And then this shows you how much the amount of ice can change, in the Arctic areas between summer and winter. This would be summer and this would be winter. You can see how much it changes from year to year. This one goes from 2007 to 2024. Well, they like to show these pictures showing icebergs calving off from glaciers. And then they'll tell us, how the ice is melting so much. But then you have to look at this graph, and then this will show you that the trend line goes pretty much across. And then after analyzing about 30,000 satellite records, a team of scientists from Thailand just announced that the temperatures in Greenland have been declining for the last 20 years. Well, that's kind of a surprise because the World Economic Forum told us that the Greenland ice sheet is at risk of total collapse. And then here's another problem, and that is the ground temperatures are still being used, but the big change since 1850 is the urban heat island effect. Now, an urban heat island is an urban area that's significantly warmer than the surrounding area. This happens because cities are made of structures like buildings and asphalt and air conditioner vents and things like that. And they re-emit the sun's heat much, much more than natural landscapes like forests and bodies of water. So this is the same weather station. You can see how that changed. About 3% of Earth's land surface is actually towns and cities. So you can see what the difference is here, that in a rural area, the ground would store a lot of that heat, and it wouldn't come bouncing back up again right away. Now, this weather station, which was once located in a grassy area, was moved to an airport, where it's now surrounded by asphalt. And when Anthony Watts, meteorologist, confronted NOAA about the stations that are influenced by the urban heat island effect, they refused to fix the problems at those stations, telling him instead that they are compensating for them. And how are they doing that? Well, they're making adjustments to the recorded temperatures. But how could they know how much of an adjustment to make? Guesswork is not science. Okay, this graph used in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, 1990 First Assessment Report, shows that temperatures from about 1000 to about 1300 AD were warmer than the present. And then after that, we had the Little Ice Age where it was colder. During the medieval warm period, about 1,000 years ago, the Vikings had a settlement in Greenland, an area that's now covered by a glacier. In the medieval warm period, grapes were grown in northern England. That's impossible now. The global warming alarmists are telling us that the medieval warm period was just a local phenomenon, but evidence for that warming is found all over the world. During the Little Ice Age, the Vikings' Greenland colony disappeared. This painting depicts ice skating on the Thames River in London in the 1600s during the Little Ice Age. We know it was colder during the Little Ice Age because the Thames River in London no longer freezes up in the winter. Some scientists believe that was the coldest period in the last 10,000 years. So getting back to this graph, in the late 1990s, the climate alarmists wanted to get rid of this graph because it showed the medieval warm period was warmer than today. So they replaced it with this graph. And this is called the hockey stick graph because of the fact that somebody saw a hockey stick. This is the blade, and this is the handle here. Anyway, this was made by somebody named Michael Mann, and he published this in 1998. And this was featured in the IPCC's third assessment report in 2000, and it became the icon of the climate change crowd. It showed temperatures from the year 1000 AD to the present being much colder than today's temperature. Mann and his team used tree rings from bristlecone pine trees. These tree rings showed recent temperatures declining. They couldn't have that, so they attached thermometer data to the endpoint of the tree ring data. This is like adding apples and oranges, and that's something you never do in science, but they did it. Two Canadian researchers, Steve McIntyre and Ross McKittrick, wanted to verify the data on which this graph was based, but Mann refused to share his data or methods he used, a basic requirement of any scientific study. It took legal action to get the information that should have been freely available. Mann's study had several errors, two databases that were exactly alike. Large gaps in the data had simply been filled in without explanation, and all 28 of the tree ring studies used to make this graph had calculation errors. Even more shocking, they found that any numbers randomly put into Mann's algorithm would produce a hockey stick shape. 7 of these 8 graphs were made using random numbers. The other was on Mann's graph. Can you identify the one on Mann's graph? McIntyre and McKittrick submitted their evaluation to Nature magazine, a science journal, but the editor refused to publish it. That would have interfered with the agenda of the climactic research unit. We couldn't have that happen. Well, how do we know that CRU had an agenda? Well, after all, they're scientists, and scientists are always honest, right? Well, our experience with the COVID pandemic has revealed how corrupt some scientists can be when they're paid enough money. In 2009, thousands of emails exchanged between prominent climate scientists over a period of several years were leaked by a whistleblower. The Russians were blamed for the leak. Those emails revealed some of the tricks that they were using to take over the field of climate science. When the editor of a science journal dared to publish the study of 2 skeptical scientists, Mann wrote, "Perhaps we should encourage our colleagues in the science research community and the climate research community to no longer submit to or cite papers in this journal." Phil Jones responded, "I will be emailing the journal. Tell them I'm having nothing more to do with it until they rid themselves of this troublesome editor." In the same year, 1998, Keith Briffa, another CRU scientist, produced a tree ring graph that showed pronounced cooling in the mid-1900s. This conflicted with some ground thermometer measurements. They said their 1980s thermometer records had been lost. They solved this problem by making up some quote-unquote modified data. In another email, Phil Jones wrote, quote, "I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years, and from 1961 for Keith's to hide the decline." In other words, they knew the temperatures were declining, so they just deleted that data. This is the data that they deleted. In science, we don't combine data from different sources. That would be apples and oranges. In science, we don't refuse to share our data with other scientists who want to verify it. And in science, we don't throw out or change data that disagrees with our agenda. Another thing that climate scientists have been doing is using computer models to predict future temperature changes. The over 100 computer models that they used predicted 3 to 4 times as much warming as what's actually occurred. This is the average of the computer models, and then this is the actual observed using balloons, satellites, and ground stations. John Christie of the University of Alabama discovered that when the model warms 1 Kelvin, it allows 1.4 watts of energy to escape. But when the temperature rises 1 Kelvin in the real world, 2.6 watts, almost twice the energy, is released. So the models show an unrealistic amount of warming. As unbelievable as it may seem, agencies in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand have been changing their own temperature records. Many scientists have been surprised and shocked to see later editions of graphs published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and NASA that were changed from their previous editions. This is the 2016 edition of that graph. And then in 2020, they made another one. As you can see, it's the same information, but they lowered the temperatures from 1996. And these dishonest men have played other tricks with graphs. This graph of heat waves begins in the 1960s, which was the coldest period in the last century. By conveniently omitting temperature data from before the 1960s, when it was warmer, they were able to hide that fact. So if you superimpose that graph, where it should be, you can see why they didn't want to show these years over here when it was so warm around the 30s in 1940 when we were having the Dust Bowl. During the 1960s and 70s, while the percentage of carbon dioxide was increasing, temperatures were getting cooler. The media hammered us with thousands of articles saying that we were heading for an ice age. But then, when the climate started to warm back up in the 1980s, they reversed their story, claiming that the Earth was warming at a frantic pace. They would like to hide this now, but they're having a hard time doing it. Okay, now Dr. Stephen Schneider wrote a book called The Genesis Strategy, and he warned that global cooling posed a threat to humanity. Schneider later changed his story, saying that global warming posed a threat to humanity. And this is what Stephen Schneider said. He said, "We need to get broad-based support to capture the public's imagination. That, of course, entails getting loads of media coverage. So we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we might have." But he was honest about that, right? Okay, now this article came from the New York Times in 1912. An unprecedentedly warm winter in the entire Arctic is believed to be the cause of the vast number of icebergs adrift in the North Atlantic Ocean during the present season and for the low latitudes, which many of them have reached. Last year, according to officials of the Hydrographic Office, the thermometer registered 94 degrees in midsummer at Irritut on the west coast of Greenland. And then, of course, on April 12th, 1912, the Titanic hit a huge iceberg that had broken off a glacier and moved south. By September of 1912, there were reports all over the world of record heat waves. A heat wave lasting for 70 days reportedly killed 40,000 people in France, and scores of people in the United States were also dying from the heat. This graph by NOAA shows that 1910, 1911, and 1912 were very cold years. Yet we know from newspaper articles and other historical records that they were exceptionally hot years. NOAA revised these temperatures downwards, changing history, and we have to wonder why. But one truth teller, Thomas Carl of NOAA in Asheville, North Carolina, said, quote, "Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, when there was much less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. And here's another interesting graph. This is the average July maximum temperatures from 1895 to 2024. So you can see that we really haven't, according to this, if you use that as your data, it's showing something quite different from what they're telling us. So anyway, basing findings on computer models, not the real world, is one thing that you shouldn't do, right? And then guesswork involving the urban heat island effect, that's another problem. Manipulating temperature data to suit their agenda. And then making up data for non-existent. Believe it or not, they've done that already. Weather stations in the Arctic. So those are all things that have been done by the climate scientists. Anyway, this is how real science should be done. First, you make careful observations and ask questions. Then you formulate a hypothesis. Then you test and measure and carefully record your data. Then you analyze the data, and then you change the hypothesis if it doesn't fit the data. That's the way science should be done, right? But this is how they're doing it, unfortunately. Start with your conclusion, which is your agenda. Man's carbon dioxide emissions are making the Earth boiling hot. Then you think of a possible hypothesis for your conclusion. Well, percentage of carbon dioxide is rising, so we caused it, right? Then number 3, change the data to fit your hypothesis. Well, you could ignore warmer temperatures from before 1960. And then last of all, personally attack or censor scientists who disagree with you. Well, climate change is really a political issue, unfortunately. Back in 1798, Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on the principle of population. He said the world's population will outgrow the food supply. And then in 1968, Paul Ehrlich wrote a very famous book called The Population Bomb. This book was wildly successful. Ehrlich incorrectly stated the battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death. Population control is the only answer. None of Ehrlich's forecasts materialized. But some people still believe the world's population should be as low as 500 million, only 1/15 of our current population. They're afraid that if third world people get the energy they desperately need to raise their living standards, the Earth population will rise even more. Okay, that's absolutely wrong. History has shown in every instance that when a population's living standards increase, the birth rate decreases. Birth-to-death rate comes down, so this would be the first thing that happens. This phenomenon is known as the demographic transition. Okay, then the birth rate a few years later will start to come down also. And industrialized civilizations have much lower birth and death rates than third world countries do. So what we really need to do to keep the population down is to improve people's living standards in third world countries. Now, 4 years after Ehrlich's book was published, Morris Strong was appointed chairman of the 1972 Earth Day United Nations Conference, in which he advocated population reduction and the lowering of living standards to save the environment. In 1988, Strong established the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is what he said a few years later. He said, "Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't that our responsibility to bring that about?" In 1968, Strong had helped to found the Club of Rome, made up of some of the richest men in the world. The members of this organization claimed that the Earth's resources were being used up too fast, especially by the industrialized nations. And the Club of Rome, frightening goal and strategy based on these mistaken ideas, was revealed in their 1991 book, The First Global Revolution, which says, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. Global warming was the perfect problem they could use to advance globalism. It was too large of a problem for one country to solve. It would take a globalist totalitarian dictatorship to impose the draconian measures we see developing, the expenditure of not just billions, but trillions of dollars, while drastically reducing our living standards and turning us into slaves, all in the name of saving the planet. The United Nations Agenda 21 plan is an action plan to inventory and control all land, all water, all minerals, all plants, all animals, all construction, all information, all energy, and all human beings in the world. In other words, it's pure socialist or fascist totalitarianism. It's very interesting that all of these United Nations agencies were set up in 1988. The United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. Strong set up those programs to create the science he needed to advance the Club of Rome's political agenda. The IPCC would provide policy recommendations for politicians, and that would usher in Agenda 21, which is now called Agenda 2030. Does that seem strange to you? To advance this agenda, they needed propaganda. Propaganda is a persuasive mass communication technique designed by psychologists to advance the interests and agenda of a particular group. Propaganda bypasses logic by using faulty reasoning, called logical fallacies, and emotional appeal. Propaganda manipulates people. We have a great responsibility to teach children, as well as adults, critical thinking skills to help them recognize the signs that they're being exploited. Well, this is a really good example of propaganda. What is wrong with this graph here? Well, it looks like they forgot something. They forgot about water vapor, which makes up 94% of all greenhouse gases. And that's not in this at all. They just totally forgot about it. Carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of the atmosphere and 4% of all greenhouse gases. Anyway, this graph, we had a hard time finding this on the internet. There's about 99% of all the graphs that you see forgot about water vapor. But anyway, this is the way it should look, right? Water vapor is 30,000 parts per million. Carbon dioxide is 415 parts per million. And methane is about 2 parts per million. So all the fuss that they make about methane now, they want to, get rid of all the farm animals, right? Here's another really good chart. This came from the Heritage Foundation. And anyway, this is all the water vapor here, which is about 3% of the atmosphere. And 3.62% of the greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide. And of those, 3.4% of all the carbon dioxide is produced by mankind. So if you take 3.4% of 3.62%, and you multiply those together, you find out that only about 1,000th of all the greenhouse gases are man-made carbon dioxide. The Earth's oceans are warming slightly, releasing dissolved carbon dioxide, and that's where we're getting most of the carbon dioxide right now. But two falsehoods abound. First of all, number one, that there's a great deal of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And number two is that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Actually, carbon dioxide is the molecule of life. Without it, photosynthesis wouldn't occur and plants wouldn't grow. If the amount of carbon dioxide would fall from its current level to about 150 parts per million, everything on Earth would die, including us, all living things. Children are now being taught that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. In previous generations, they were taught about photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide combines with water in the presence of light and chlorophyll to form sugar and oxygen. And here's another problem that we have with propaganda, and that's logical fallacies, errors in logic used to deceive people. The first one they call ad hominem, which means against the man in Latin, which either directly calls names such as climate denier or indirectly disparages those who disagree by selling their credentials. Like they might say that they're on the fringe or something like that. The second logical fallacy is straw man, and that is to distort your opposition's argument and then knock it down. So a climate change denier is someone who denies that the climate is changing. No skeptic ever said it wasn't changing. Third one would be bandwagon, and that states that everyone supports the agenda and that anyone who disagrees then doesn't belong. This works because of the basic human need to be on the winning team. So 97% of all scientists, that's bandwagon, right? Number 4 is appeal to authority. We are constantly told to trust the experts without any evidence. The telltale sign here is the lack of information given. We are never told that there are other experts who disagree with the experts. The fifth one would be moving the goalpost. When Earth stopped warming after 2000, the fearmongers simply changed their term from global warming to climate change to falsely imply that this crisis was causing storms, droughts, etc. And no matter what happens, if it gets colder or warmer, wetter or drier, this is all caused by climate change. There's no way to disprove their hypothesis. Karl Popper said, a hypothesis that can't be disproved is invalid. A recent CNN report claimed that global warming doesn't always mean warming. Quote, the term global warming confuses people because it triggers thoughts about warmth, and it sort of lends itself to misinterpretation when it also impacts the cold, declared Mike Holm of the University of Cambridge. And then here's another quote. When we get a lot of snow, this is what we're told. Quote, not only are severe snowstorms possible in a warming climate, they may even be more likely. These storms draw much of their intensity from the extreme contrast between cold air over land and warmer, wetter air from over the ocean, asserted a NOAA spokesperson. So as you can see, there's no way to disprove that, right? Another way that they've moved the goalposts is to keep advancing their tipping points after their current tipping point comes and goes without materializing. In January of 2000, Michael Oppenheimer told the New York Times it doesn't take a scientist to size up the effects of snowless winters on the children too young to remember the record-setting blizzards of 1996. And then I left out something, so I'm going to go back here. Another thing they did was they had a 1990 PBS documentary series entitled Race to Save the Planet, which predicted that by the year 2000, the world's average temperature would be 4 degrees warmer. And of course, that never happened. On March 29, 2001, CNN stated, in 10 years' time, most of the low-lying atolls surrounding Tuvalu's 9 islands in the South Pacific Ocean will be submerged underwater as global warming rises sea levels. But in 2018, the Daily Mail reported that the land area of this chain of islands made of coral atolls is actually growing in size. None of the many predictions and tipping points has ever materialized, yet the media keep churning them out as if they will. Number 6 is appeal to sympathy, and that blames the skeptics for the plight of the polar bear and the victims of storms, and even forest fires, which statistics show are no worse than they've ever been. Yep, that's what they keep telling everybody. Okay, number 7 is guilt by association or poisoning the well. These experts in psychology have tried to create false links between climate skeptics and groups like the Flat Earth Society. The science is unequivocal, said John Kerry, Biden's climate czar. President Obama and I believe very deeply that we do not have time for a meeting anywhere in the Flat Earth Society. This map of the United States in National Geographic magazine, in November 2013, depicts a sea level rise of 262 feet after we've used up all our fossil fuel. But such a sea level increase could occur only if all of Antarctica's glaciers melted. But the amount of ice in Antarctica has been increasing in recent years, despite the discovery of 91 volcanoes under the ice in West Antarctica. It would take millions of years then for something like this to occur. Anyway, this is something else that came from Proxy data, and this is where we are right here. So if you look at these anomalies, you can see that we're right here, up here at the peak. And if you look at these other peaks about 1,000 years apart, you can see that ours isn't even as high as these other peaks. What really concerns me, though, by looking at this, is that we seem like we could be ready for a precipitous slide downward in temperatures. So how can we communicate with people that are really worried about climate change? Well, we could try asking some questions. Question number 1, can you please show me how carbon dioxide that we're emitting by burning fossil fuels is causing the Earth to heat up? Well, they really can't. They don't have any proof. And in fact, if you look at some other Proxy data, this is very interesting here from the ice cores and Lake Vostok down in Antarctica. And here you can see that the temperature actually changes before the carbon dioxide level changes. So it's actually the exact opposite of what they've been telling us. It's actually the temperatures that are causing the carbon dioxide level to go up. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the oceans heat up and release more carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide dissolves better in cold water than it does in warmer water. So when the ocean heats up, then that releases more carbon dioxide. And this is a very, very good chart here that you could show them. This shows that water vapor is indeed the main greenhouse gas. It's emitting a lot more energy than carbon dioxide is down here. And also, look where methane is. There's just hardly any change at all. They never mention oxygen and ozone or any of these other ones, even rain scattering. Now, number 2 question, we could say, if we stop producing synthetic nitrogen fertilizer because the production of fossil fuels has gone to net zero, what fertilizer will be used in its place to fulfill the UN Sustainable Development Goal of no hunger? And this was the cause of the 2022 coup that they had in Sri Lanka, where the people were told that they were not allowed to use any artificial fertilizer that was coming from natural gas. And their crops failed, and there was a lot of starvation. And question number 3, carbon dioxide makes up about 0.04% of the atmosphere. What's going to happen if the world reduces the carbon dioxide level down to net zero? The lack of nitrogen fertilizer made from natural gas will considerably reduce agricultural output, and up to 1 billion people will starve. The world's economies will collapse due to outrageous prices and lack of energy, as well as the expense and environmental damage from mining of the minerals to build all the batteries for solar panels and electric vehicles. And desert areas will grow, and the earth will be less green. Question number 4, there are over 6,000 products made from petroleum, which is a mixture of hydrocarbons. If petroleum is no longer available, where will we get asphalt, for road paving, lubricants, pharmaceuticals, paints, cement, plastic, ammonia, and steel? Question number 5, how much of the land surface of the United States will be needed to build enough solar panels and wind turbines to meet U.S. net zero goals? The answer is at least 375,000 square miles. Americans today are using about 525 gigawatts to 1 billion watts of electrical power. Based on the amount of land being used by our biggest wind and solar farms and the amount of electricity they produce, at least 375,000 square miles of land would be needed for net zero. That's about 1/8 of the total area of the United States. And question number 6, what will happen to the homes of the animals and people in these 375,000 square miles? Whales and dolphins are being slaughtered by offshore wind farms, as well as all the birds, too, that are being mangled by the wind turbines. The problem is going to get a lot worse. And the irony is that while climate activists pretend to care about the environment, they're actually destroying it. Question number 7, most EV charging stations in the United States are using electricity produced by coal or natural gas power plants. Their owners don't seem to understand this. How do these electric vehicles reduce the emissions of fossil fuels? The answer, they don't. It's all for show. So the summary, number 1, climate change is a political issue, and the IPCC is a political organization. Number 2, the percentage of carbon dioxide has risen mainly because of the warming ocean. And number 3, there is no proof or even evidence that carbon dioxide is a temperature control knob. Number 4, we don't know how much the Earth's average or mean temperature has risen in the last 200 years. Number 5, carbon dioxide is a minor greenhouse gas, 4/100ths of the atmosphere, 4/100ths of 1% of the atmosphere. The main greenhouse gas is water vapor. Number 6, the urban heat island effect has falsely inflated temperature readings. And number 7, trillions of dollars have been wasted so far on climate change mitigation efforts. So anyway, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about this, I wrote a book and published it in 2023, that was last year, Exposing the Great Climate Change Lie. That's available on Amazon. So that's my presentation.
You have time for a question or two?
I sure do.
All right. Just one observation is I really like your communication style. I have the book in front of me here, and it is so clear and you use so much data and so many great quotes from people. Do you think part of the reason for your communication style is because you were you spent a career teaching physics and other subjects? Yeah. You think that helps you in communicating?
Well, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to read one quote here that you had in your book, Chapter 5, from Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate.
Yes.
One can easily be deceived by deferring to the authority of supposed experts. I love that.
Yes, that's for sure. That's really what science is, belief in the ignorance of the experts, because nobody has all the answers. And that's a really unstable science that's on a very shaky foundation. Well, I think the whole thing's going to topple over.
I'm going to read a couple more quotes here from the back. You have so many good quotes. This one is from James Lovelock, who proposed the Gaia hypothesis and once believed in AGW. He said, quote, "I'm not sure the whole thing isn't crazy." So he flipped.
Well, that's good that he was able to admit that he was wrong about something. A lot of people don't do that.
Yeah, yeah. And here's one from Dr. Richard Toll, who is a UN IPCC lead author. It disturbs me hearing people like Al Gore say that he is worried about the future of his grandchildren. Complete madness. That's from an IPCC lead author. Amazing. That the BBC would not report a quote like that, right? The mainstream media won't report the quotes that don't support the narrative.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So Lynne Balzer,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much for doing this. You are great at what you do. I appreciate it. Talk to you next time.
Thank you. Actually, very honored to be here because I'm among great company with some of the other people that you've interviewed.